See, this is Big Brother at work. It's automatically bringing up my presentation. Okay, to wrap up here and summarize some things, this could have been the title of Jimmy's presentation, Nirvana. We've talked about all of this kind of stuff so much over the years, trying to figure out how to fix things, how to make the grid work better, and so on. What I want to do is, I guess, point to a few questions for some discussion and consideration later in the day that are the dilemmas in this. Getting this done. Let's see. This is just kind of summarizes for us what the typical quandaries are in the electric power system, not just here, but in electric power systems around the world. And I guess one of the questions I would raise, having listened to Peter and Jimmy, is maybe we're actually pricing the wrong thing. Maybe the commodity is actually reliability and not electrons, or reliability and not capacity. Of course, underlying electrons and capacity is what we think we know about reliability. But what if we conducted an experiment and we had an auction for reliability and actually forced the consumer who says, gee, I want 99.9% reliability to go into the auction and then, actually be forced to pay something for it? What if we did that and we found out that the customer wasn't willing to pay very much? That's the problem. We say we want it, and then we try to enact policy to do it, but then when it comes time to paying for it, what we end up with are customers that really don't want to pay as much as we need to spend in order to be able to give them the 99.9% reliability that they want. I mean, it's terrifically inconvenient to have blackouts and brownouts, but maybe there is a calculated risk somewhere in there that from time to time that will happen, and the customer will take that risk rather than making sure that the power is always there whenever the customer wants it. We haven't really asked that question, and maybe that's something that we need to do. And then if we ask the question and we learned what the customer really wanted, then we can go back and figure out what it is that we're really trying to build and what people are willing to accept. Now, I guess to react to one other quick thing that Jimmy raised in terms of how we look at our system and use our system and try to figure this stuff out, one of the things that we've always done is we've embedded reliability into a cost of service rate-making approach that wasn't very efficient and a lot of times wasn't very optimal, but it more or less worked. And what we think we can do, or what we want to try to do, is get to something that's better, but it's very difficult to get there. So we've kind of got this dilemma. In taking the system apart to be able to do some of the things that we want to try to do, if we're going to use market design to get there and not take a big brother approach of simply pushing R&D and pushing new technology without having to deal with the erratic customer behavior that's actually out there, then what we have to do is think about what exactly are the problems that we're trying to solve. One, how do you actually value generation capacity and price it and get it into the system if you're going to do something other than a cost of service rate making approach? And then the second problem on the other end, on the grid end, is how do you provide access to the grid and capacity to move electrons and to deal with to provide the services to deal with the reliability issues, and come up with a market design for that works. So those are really fundamentally the dilemmas. Now, to put this into perspective, I guess, from a political point of view, when we were looking at the situation in California and sort of thinking about it here, looking at the Texas Interconnect, what we call the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and then trying to figure out what the possibilities are if we take this nirvana thing that we're after, real-time pricing, and we want to try to figure out how to get there, there are all the logical questions that flow out of this. One of the big ones is, does choice matter? Now, this is where the political rubber hits the road. If what we're going to do is try to use consumer behavior to get the things that we want, then we have to deal with the consumers who are also voters, which is often a very unpleasant exercise. And this is where the federal, state differences of opinion and large customers versus small customers and people who use electricity 7 and 7 versus people who use it at 8 o'clock in the morning and then from 5 to 7 p.m. in the evening, that's where all of these differences really come into play. And this is also where the bottom line economics questions get revealed. Because while in the aggregate, doing something like real-time pricing might be able to yield real savings and benefits back system-wide, the problem is that from the discrete customer level, oftentimes it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. The customer can't see enough of a difference for it to really inspire the customer to sign on to the choice program that's being presented to the customer in the first place. Now, I'm convinced that one of the reasons why Amy invited me here today is because a few years ago, as I recall, we were together at some conference, I don't remember where, and I was waxing eloquent on all of this stuff, and I was talking about the nirvana of real-time pricing, and Amy did her usual thing. She has 3 kids, right? I have 2 cats. And it was a giant reality check, as in, I'm not going to spend my time during the day, figuring out what to do because my meter is telling me that my electricity price is, 1 penny different than it was 15 minutes ago. I'm not going to live my life like that. Nobody's going to live a life like that, not in our world. So the fundamental problem is what is it that we're actually trying to design in a world in which the increment of difference in the daily life of a customer is very minimal, except on certain occasions. But the aggregate difference to all of us as a society can be huge, but nobody wants to make a decision. So that's kind of where we are. The measurement problem, of course, is what Peter mentioned. When we talk about doing this stuff, there's a cost, there's an infrastructure cost. So part of the cost equation from the customer is what the customer has to pay in order to measure the amount of electricity that's being used and detect the prices for this whole thing to work. And so for a typical household, it turns out that this is kind of a problem unless you can come up with, a technology solution that really makes a difference. The market structure issue, I'm going to ask a question that Pat will answer during lunch. This is something that has been on my mind for a while, and one of our colleagues brought this up last week. He's with one of the last surviving merchant electric power development companies. And his question, which is my question, which was, who decides what the market structure should be? Should the regulator do that? And therefore, you really need, as Jimmy says, to go out and work with the regulators and get the regulators to design the markets? Well, that's an imperfect way of getting things done. Regulators are, like the rest of us, talented and very smart people in many cases. In some cases, in some of the states we work in, well, I'll be diplomatic. Let me pull back from that remark. Forget I said that, strike it from the record. But at any rate, it puts the regulator in a position of having to make decisions in which many cases the regulatory body isn't really fully capable or doesn't have 100% of the capacity that it needs to do that, because the regulatory body is not the operator, for one thing, nor is the regulatory body the customer. It's a mediator. It's trying to address and balance the public interest in with this myriad of mixed signals, and in a world in which a lot of this stuff gets complicated very fast because of the dynamics of electric power systems in the first place. If a regulator makes a mistake, and this was a question that was asked to me by someone on the staff of a regulatory commission, then do we have something like regulatory malfeasance? That's kind of an interesting thought. And if so, then who decides what the penalty should be if the regulator actually makes a mistake in market design, and it costs everybody a lot of money because the market doesn't work the way it was supposed to? That's kind of an interesting thing to think about as well. So there I am down in the bottom corner having a blonde day, which was yesterday, when we had the umpteenth power outage in our particular building in our particular part of the Houston metro area, which for some reason I don't understand why this keeps happening in our building, and it shuts down all our servers, and then we have to restart everything, and the email doesn't work, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of a customer, and I have to admit that, given what I do for a living and how I look at these things, I will tell you that I have never participated in the Texas Choice Program. I'm with the same provider that I started out with when we moved back to Texas in 1985, so you know who that is. And I've never been able to find enough incentive to change my household to a different program, although maybe I ought to reconsider that, considering where we are with natural gas prices. So I'm a perfect embodiment of the entire dilemma. I'm an overeducated person, overly sensitized to all of these issues, and yet I'm still hanging on with the same old guy providing me the electricity to my household that I always have. And by the way, I'm still an AT&T customer too, even though I do have a cell phone, I'll admit that. Okay, let me just, by closing, show a couple of things to illustrate some of what Peter was talking about, and then one tiny little example of an experiment in Texas. These two customers, A and B, there were changes in response to changes in prices in California, but they are still very inelastic in terms of their preferences. And that's an important thing, and we debate this all the time. How much elasticity is there really in the system? How willing, how responsive are customers really to price? Big customers are. We know that. We have success in the ERCOT experiment when it comes to the big customers. We have some success when it comes to the larger customers. We don't have very much success at all when it comes to the really small customers that have much less flexibility in their daily patterns with respect to electricity use. Now, part of that is technology. So if we do the things that people have been talking about so that the system is more sensitive to the customer's use patterns, then all of a sudden you have a different situation. But, you know, the time frame for solving that and embedding those system sensitivities is, of course, the Nirvana and Jimmy's model. And then let me just show you quickly our two little examples. So within ERCOT, what we did with Reliant a few years ago, about 3 years ago or so, was look at two examples of commercial customers, one that was smaller and one that was larger, and one in which the load profile for the customer is fairly close to the profile as ERCOT measures it and the profile that ERCOT uses for settlement, and then a customer in which the load profile is relatively different. So here's customer one, here's customer two, much more difference between that customer's profile and the ERCOT settlement profile. And just going quickly to the results, what you can see here is, given the assumptions for gas prices, and so this dates the study, $1.50 per million BTU gas at the low end and $3.50 per million BTU at the high end, tells you that, in fact, we ought to revisit this today and see whether people could actually find more incentive to install real-time metering and real-time pricing strategies than what we found when we did this study. But the bottom line for this was that it was very difficult for the customers that were getting low savings from looking at a potential real-time strategy to actually get them to be enthusiastic about incurring the front-end cost of participating in that kind of marketplace. So I think those are the only things that I have to add to the discussion thus far, and we'll see what kind of questions we have. I'm not by any means suggesting that we need to rethink what we're doing here. Quite the contrary. What I think we need to do is actually accelerate our thinking about these issues of market design, who gets to decide, how you deal with the customer politics, how you accelerate technologies, the right kind of technologies. And that's also a difficulty which Jimmy, I think, didn't point out, but maybe we could talk about. We make a lot of these decisions and we allocate our R&D spending, and these things are years into the future in terms of lead times. A lot of the solutions, I think, in problems like this can actually be smaller, cheaper, and fairly elegant before we get to the really big solutions that we think we really need to do. And sometimes I feel that our, not so much our policy environment, but our R&D environment, our scientific environment, doesn't recognize that enough. And I think that's something that maybe we need to inspire. Thank you.
Okay, invite the panel if you have any comments on each other's or questions for each other.
One comment I guess I would make on some of Michelle's comments on the elasticity is, in the Californian case at least, households that had air conditioning had a much more elastic response. Sure. And of course the key idea was that when the price of electricity is a little higher, they just set the thermostat a little higher. And so actually you get, in that case, quite a degree of saving. And the other point I made is, of course, if the costs are passed on, the savings in the system are passed on to households, that also will give them a benefit to switching. And the other comment I'd make is too that the other advantage of real-time pricing in terms of distributed generation is it also gives households an incentive to use their own generation when that's a lower cost alternative than buying from the grid. So it also plays a critical role in driving distributed generation.
I think the only thing that I would say to what Michelle said, her last comment, was when we created GridWorks and GridWise at the Department of Energy, the reason we did it was because we believed that there were technologies that had been created and studied, and the research and development had been done, and they'd been sitting on a shelf. And that was the low-hanging fruit that we could take a minimal amount of money and test and integrate them into the grid in different regions of the country, and do get a really good bang for the buck before we went and did the next type of materials research. I will say that this Secretary of Energy right now, Sam Bodman, is moving back quickly towards the federal government doing only basic research. And more of the applied research is not the federal government's responsibility. So we saw a window that we needed to push what was there into the grid for the reasons that I went through, that people weren't integrating it. Well, let's help buy down the risk. Let's help with the modeling. Let's help with use all of this lab support that everybody thinks is such a great gem around the country, and utilize that to the benefit of all the consumers that would gain some benefit there. That was our rationale.
I guess the only thing that I would add quickly is that on the question of does choice matter, well, of course it does. Peter, you answered that. And so, I mean, back to the simple, elegant, but maybe excruciatingly politically difficult solution on all of this. If you could just let the price signals flow where they need to flow, people will do the simple thing first, and all of a sudden, voila, you'll get some load management out of it. Then that tells you what the rest of the problem is that you need to wrestle with. So if we could just get the first part done, then we could focus our attention on the stuff that really we need to think about, you know, like new materials and other things that make sense as you reinvest in the grid, update, add new equipment, you know, all of that sort of stuff.
I think it's going to be a long time before we have our politicians not really care or talk much about markets or the electric power system anymore.
I'm afraid so.
The result of Enron and California and everything else that's gone on over the last blackout over the last 5 years, they are very willing to say bad things about it and stop things, but they're not willing to get up and be the advocate and say we need to do something smart, we need to do something creative, we need to do something innovative.
But if you have a sort of decentralized market-driven system, then you know, utilities will have a profit incentive to pursue these new technologies and so on, rather than having this problem of it will it go into the rate base or not. So I mean that's part of the story here with the time-based pricing and a more distributed, decentralized system is it also gives the private incentive to invest in new technologies.
In a perfect world, I completely agree with that, but I think now you have so many utility executives that are between their regulators, and many of them are doing exactly what their regulators say. And when you pull back and try to take a whole other avenue, and the regulators are really in control of your rates, your revenue. So it makes it hard in many areas of the country, but in a perfect world, I think you're right.
Ken?
Well, I'm not sure how to say this, but it seems like there's still a gap in what I'm hearing between what we could call the Smalley vision and what we have here in the following sense. I think Rick was very interested in the future of energy, very interested in how we deal with the crisis in energy, both on the supply side and on the environmental side, especially CO2. What it sounds like to me, what I'm hearing, is kind of curing the grid or maybe even band-aiding the grid. I don't hear a grid that's ready or looking forward to being a much, much bigger part of our energy infrastructure. And I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about that if it's only that, well, we just don't do that yet.
I think part of the answer to that is the analogy we had this morning with the telecommunications industry versus the electrical industry. That if you had a much more decentralized market-driven system, the electric companies would have an incentive to pursue these new technologies like the telephone companies have had. So.
But I don't know if I agree with that, because I think what we're saying, or what should be evident, is that a more market-responsive system with price signals flowing where they should flow is going to get people to do things that actually yields benefits elsewhere. A customer that turns down the air conditioner and uses less electricity is also going to be using less fuel to manufacture electricity, which impacts everything else. I mean, we know that. I mean, so, you know, it's not just a Band-Aid approach. It's part of the overall picture. You don't, you know, I don't think it's a matter of just plunking down money to build an entirely new system. I think there are a lot of things that you can do that get people to start behaving the way you want them to behave before you do that. I mean, I think both things have to be addressed. And I guess the one other thing that I would add that I always get frustrated about is that we always talk about an energy crisis and that sort of thing. What we really have are constraints that are associated with our known existing technologies and the economics associated with those. The universe is full of energy. I mean, that's not the problem. The problem isn't running out of energy in a physical sense. It's the constraints that we face given what we know now and what we can do today.
I kind of agree with you. If you have local generation and local storage, what does it matter if the grid fails? Because you can self-supply.
Well, yeah,
whether it be your house or your neighborhood or your microgrid of the region or the city. So the point is, how do you push it down there so that the big, you know, interstate transmission grid doesn't really cause big regional blackouts?
Or goes away?
You know, I think it's going to be a long, long time before it goes away. I don't think we can demand without it. But I think I kind of agree with you, and I agree with Rick Smalley, that the more you push that down, the less strain there is on the overarching interstate transmission grid. And at some point in time, we will always put a value on reliability, whether consumers do or not. There will always be a regulatory cost to it. But in fact, he might be right that in 2050, it may be so distributed that, you know, you may not need a high voltage transmission system that has 5 nines of reliability.
Well, I think there was another part, and that was long distance transmission. So I don't think the grid goes away. I think you just have a very intelligent, and I think he would like to see a universal grid. We're talking here about providing, you know, wind power from one portion of the world to another portion of the world, solar power from North Africa to Germany, U.S. Southwest to New York City. I mean, these are really radical compared to the kind of problems we're generally talking about here. I just hope that the things that you're talking about are the things that lead to solving the problems for those things, too.
And I think the context, too, which getting back to my original opening remarks is, you know, the system that develops now was working now because you had $3.50 natural gas. And what are the prospects that that's actually going to continue, right? I mean, the things we're using for fuels now and the things that we're using for fuels in the transportation sector, you know, it's working okay. And Americans, you know, down here we had this little blip for the hurricane, and then we relaxed environmental specifications for a few weeks, and now everybody can go back to driving the way they wanted to. But the bottom line is there could be an event out there that's not a 2-day hurricane in New Orleans. There could be a political disruption in the Middle East or something else of that nature that's not going to last for 2 days. It's going to last for a month or longer. And then all the things we're talking about are going to come back to bite us big time, because people are going to want to rely on something that they can control, right? you know, I was in Russia actually when the 2003 blackout happened in New York, and I was actually traveling with a group of Congress people. And we had been talking about all the really heavy subjects like North Korea having a nuclear bomb that could hit California, or proliferation in, 10 million third world countries all around the world, and how will you control the uranium from making to a dirty bomb. And after 4 days of that, I was incredibly pessimistic that the world was going to continue anyway. And I said at dinner the night before my talk, I said, well, I don't even think we really care what the price of gasoline is. Now that we're here, we're all going to die from, some, conflagration having to do with the weapon systems we have dispersed all around the world. And everybody laughed. And we all went to bed, and I was joking with my husband that I couldn't sleep because I don't know what the hell I'm going to talk about tomorrow that's going to be the same context of what Bill Perry said yesterday. And we flip on the TV because I can't sleep, and of course we're watching all of you in the blackout. And I said, geez, well, that's my opening line. I mean, my opening line is, look at all the things you can't do without this thing that a minute ago, last night, you thought wasn't important, right? So, I mean, the question is really, from my perspective, is not, the market will deliver it at the moment we have this conflagration of energy supply. The market will deliver all these things because, as you all know from our presenters and later on in this conference, the technology is out there, right? But the question is, at the scale we're going to need it.
Can I follow up with one thing on that too, which is, again, to go back to the first session this morning, contrast the telecoms and electricity. The point was made that the United States actually spends more on electricity than on telecommunications, but the innovation is so much greater in telecommunications, and we also saw figures on the percentage that the industry is spending on R&D and so forth. And part of my point is that in a much more competitive environment, the firms are driven to try to innovate and compete, and spend money on R&D and so forth. And part of the issue with the electricity industry is the lack of that competitive market-driven environment.
I think that's really the bottom line. Unless you fully test and you're willing to really get out there and collect the data in a good test, in an open, competitive, reasonably well-working market environment, you don't know what's going to happen. And when it comes time to making decisions about billions of dollars spent on R&D, how can you possibly make the right decision without having done that? I don't think it fully allows people to innovate. So we have obviously divergent viewpoints on that.
As one of the stung consumers of the last attempt to deregulate the utility industry, I feel like I've stepped into Alice in Wonderland here, where everybody talks about utilities are going to get great when they have complete competitiveness. Maybe I missed something. But one thing I did hear early today was that China would tell people in China what to do, and they would do it. And the person who was giving that talk was optimistic that the Chinese would do something before us, or pessimistic we wouldn't do something as soon as the Chinese. I worry that maybe our metaphors might be getting out of whack here. And maybe we need to think again about what we need to do if we're going to meet this availability of energy crisis. Since the world is made out of atoms, I agree, and there's an awful lot of energy there.
We are very honored to have today as our keynote speaker for lunch, Mr. Pat Wood III. Pat is the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but that doesn't do justice to his service that he did as the head of the FERC. If you were the head of the FERC and you just had the Enron crisis, that would be a very big challenge. If you were the head of the FERC and you just had the electricity crisis in California, that would be a big challenge. If you were the head of the FERC and you had a major blackout that knocked out electricity through the whole Northeast, that would be an incredible challenge. But poor Pat had all three during his tenure, and he showed a lot of leadership that made those situations much more ameliorated than they probably could have been. We're lucky to have Pat back down here home. He was the chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas and brought us to the point to having successful competition and deregulation here in our state. We're often cited as a model for what to do as opposed to, say, California. And he has worked as a lawyer, and he's also an engineer. so he knows from whence he speaks. And he is currently serving as an independent director of SunPower Corporation, which is a solar technology company. So that makes him uniquely open to many of the different things we've been discussing today. And also he's on a director of competitive Texas Genco. So with that, I welcome Pat Wood.
All right. Thank you very much, Amy. Thank y'all for letting me talk to you over what I consider a classic lunch. The Good Company is probably undernamed. It's probably the best company, but I don't know if I get free barbecue for that little plug, but I'll work on it. I appreciate what we're talking about here today. This is one of my favorite topics to think about, and I really particularly like the perspective under which we're looking at it here today. We're not looking at it from the inside the beltway perspective of who won and who lost on the energy bill, and we're not looking at it from the Wall Street perspective of who's up and who's down on this world event or this commodity price. No, we're looking at these issues, as Dr. Smalley did, from the perspective of the same thing that has driven so much of the significant growth in the world's economy in the past quarter century, excuse me, and that's technological innovation. To wit, what has been done and what more can be done to promote technological innovation on the power system. Well, let's look at the past and glean from it the future. In looking at the Continental transmission grid, it has to be admitted that it has done an acceptable job of doing what we want it to do, which is to keep the lights on. Using basic 1950s era technology that I think one of our earlier speakers today reminded us won the Invention of the Century Award for the 20th century. It has been an enviable record here in North America. Can't say that for the rest of the world, but certainly in North America, the reliability of the grid here is enviable. Looking at the high visibility blackouts in 1965, in 1978, in 1996, 98, 2003, they are notable mostly in their relative infrequency. So reliability has been a hallmark of the current grid. So much so that our society has taken it for granted that when the lights did go out, everything did fall apart. It was painful to be a regulator, as I know Jimmy Gotfelty felt too when he was at the Department of Energy. When in August of 2003, after a relatively short duration blackout, some multiple billions of dollars of economic value in Canada and in the northeastern United States were lost. And that does show that we have taken it quite a bit for granted. Amy, you're humorous, slightly humorous, I guess, because we all lived through it. It wasn't humorous at all. But your humorous anecdote about the night before you had to give a speech, there was this great big reminder that forget about nukes in North Korea, we got power out in all North America. So that was a little bit different deal. But these two recent blackouts, the 96 Western one, which curiously as a Texas regulator at the time, El Paso, Texas is part of the Western grid. So when a large bird built an avian structure in Bonneville, Oregon, the lights went out in El Paso. Okay, that's what you talk about when you talk about a regional grid. When that happened there and the 2003 blackout happened in the Northeast, we have seen the limitations of the grid as it has been designed. The grid that we have has been designed to support local electric power needs. That's what our big backbone grid is, really a lot of little backbones that support the Houstons, the Dallases, I would have said New Orleanses, but I'll move on, the Atlantas of the world. To be sure, the formation of NERC and the Regional Reliability Councils after the 1965 New York blackout did lead to more interconnectivity between neighboring utilities, but that interconnection was for emergencies only. Trade based on economics and on efficiency began slowly, only as capacity was available, or at least perceived to be available, and usually only with the next door neighbor utility. This was a far cry from the more competitive power markets that we see today. It was FERC's Order 888 in 1996 that required all transmission grid owners to provide open access to their wires to any paying customer that we began to evolve toward a more regional grid. In Texas, the same step was taken actually the year earlier with a similar grid opening initiative sponsored by the legislature. With the veiled threat that expansion may be required if it's not provided to customers willing to pay, many transmission owners made capacity available to competing generation-owning customers, utilized their grids more efficiently, and grudgingly expanded when they had to. Recognizing that this utility-by-utility slow game was not going to result in meaningful competitive trade and customer savings anytime in our lifetime, in 1999, the FERC adopted an Order Number 2000, which yours truly has had the joy of implementing, which fostered the development of regional grid operators. Our relative ease in sponsoring and setting up the first independent grid operator in the country here in Texas back in 1996 spoiled me into thinking that it wouldn't be so hard to do the same thing for the rest of the country. Well, I was wrong. But the joy and the invigorating joy of getting out of bed every day for a good old Texas-style brawl has really gotten me going for the last decade, and pushing both sleepy and greedy, and sometimes sleepy and greedy are the same utility, into the 20th century as we're on the brink of the 21st has been my job description for the last 10 years. And it's one that I think at this point has certainly got us to where we have 70% of the nation's economy now under an independently operated power grid, which I'll mention in a moment, I think is a real precursor for what we need to have to get to the vision that we've all talked about today. And most of these places have also the very much enhanced additional benefit of overlaying on top of an independently operated power grid an organized, transparent marketplace where bulk power is bought and sold on an hourly basis. Moving to market-based pricing for generation, which was an important step that took place really quietly, honestly, in the last 13 years, and also shifting the risk of new power plant construction from the backs of the captive ratepayer to the risk takers in the marketplace, the investors. This has yielded so many other benefits for the economy, just in terms of the efficiency alone, usually lower prices than we would see under regulation without question, even though it's hard to see today when the fuel prices are pushing everything up. Trust me, those fuel prices would push regulated and are pushing regulated rates up quite a bit as well. But importantly, and as I've heard a lot this morning, important focus on when, where, and how is the best place to invest in the next unit of generation. When should it be dispatched? Speaking of pricing, one other accomplishment of the power sector that has had an impact on the present and has laid the groundwork for future improvements is the shift away from average cost pricing. Now, as you may remember, all the annual costs of a utility, this is regulator speak 101, so I'll put back on my green eye shades and say, here's how we do it. All the costs from last year are added together, and that's the numerator. And all the units sold last year are added together, and that's the denominator. And you do the division right there, and there's your average rate, and that's what you pay for every kilowatt hour you use all year long. This sort of pricing does so very little to customers about the relative cost of their power needs. I think Michelle and Jimmy both talked about on the last panel. The summer air conditioner user thinks he's just as entitled to that, 12 cent per kilowatt hour rate as the guy who's crawling out of bed at 4 a.m. in November and flipping on a light bulb to read a book. I've been one of those guys. I have a newborn at home. But I should caveat that in deeming this move an accomplishment of the power sector, this movement away from average cost pricing, since real-time pricing and its fuzzy cousin time of use pricing are just only recently on the scene and only in a few places, but its best days are yet to come. Open access to the grid was an important step that the industry has taken, but another key barrier has remained, and that's the barrier placed on a generator to interconnect to the grid. Back in the earlier career, my good friend Jimmy Glotfelty brought to the PUC of Texas a complaint from Calpine about the difficulty they were having interconnecting on the power grid in South Texas. This was in 1997 and 98. So it puzzled me that shortly after we'd set up the one-stop shop at ERCOT, that anybody was having trouble interconnecting to the grid. Well, it turned out that the one-stop shop actually was a set of detours kind of behind the scenes, and so that has subsequently gotten fixed. But that complaint, that business-based complaint, led to a collaborative effort here in Texas to create a standardized interconnection contract and process with very strict timetables that must be met by both the customer and the utility provider and ERCOT, and made sure that really we were a big welcome mat state for interconnection. Now this is true across the country, because at FERC we did the same thing with order number 2003 that was adopted a couple years ago. So creating a level playing field for those who are taking the risk in this economy, the risk-taking competitive power generators, is a must-do step. Now, unfortunately, the difficulty of tying to a utility and then the important step of moving that power from the generation plant to a customer really is, in a few places, still a difficult thing to do and to do fairly. And that's where the last really remaining anti-competitive practices take place on the power grid. But the good news is it has been largely eliminated by a transparent system, by active enforcement of regulations, by courts who can read the law, and by a new generation of leadership at the utility companies. So the new battleground is the little grid, the distribution system, where so much potential exists, but so little is being allowed. That's why state efforts such as the one here in Texas in the year 2000 and national efforts such as the Standard Interconnection Agreement for small generators, both less than 2 megawatts and from 2 megawatts to 20 megawatts, and less than 200 kilowatts were the three camps of small generators, now have standardized interconnection agreements at FERC too. And those are important parts of busting down yet another barrier to entry. One final wrinkle on this last point as far as accomplishments of the past is the use of the grid, both the high voltage grid and the low voltage grid, but particularly the latter grid, for non-utility functions. And by this today I'm talking about using the magnetic field created by the electric current running through the wire to propagate broadband communications. BPL, broadband over power lines, is for real. I've seen it happen. I've seen it deployed in cities in Northern Virginia. It's an exciting thing, and it's one that the federal spectrum regulator, who is the FCC, has resolved the technical interference issues with radio. Not I wouldn't say amicably, but they made the decision, as I think regulators do best, make decisions and then move on, and people work with it from there. So now it's up to the utilities and the state regulators to get the incentives right to draw this capability into this ubiquitous bunch of copper, as we've heard about under the streets of New York. And I think the state regulators in this regard are going to be very helpful, because I've been one. We regulated the phone companies and the power companies here. And most regulators in this country do want to see some competition, more competition for the traditional telco and cable duopoly who are providing broadband today. So the wires company, if the utility can be incented to be creative, can be a real opportunity there to be that third wire that's used for the home. And so now let's look at, that's accomplishments. Let's look at this year's energy law. I share Jimmy's view. It's a huge missed opportunity. But like in all things, I guess we all, products of the Reagan era, do always look for that little bright opportunity in a mop hole full of manure. And there is, I think, a few here. I've looked for those unexpected things that 10 years from now we'll look back and go, aha, that was a signal provision that made a lot of difference for the country. This one was frustrating to watch. Jimmy and I were both there during the period, and a number of you in this room have viewed it from closer, from far, and it turned from a good public policy debate, as I think we had in earlier years of regulation, to really just a lobbyist festival. And so you really hope and pray when stuff gets through that you do get some good outcomes. But I do know from history and from the Holy Bible and from Star Wars that the good guys do win in the end. And I'm going to make this prediction about where the seeds from victory will fall out of this law. And they'll sound familiar for those of you who listened in the morning. Before I do that, I want to look back. 1978, PURPA, Public Utility Regulatory Practices Act, Policies Act. Congress passed this in the wake of the last energy crisis, 5 years later. Then that crisis happened, but they passed it. And Section 210 of that act, which related to a utilities mandatory cogeneration power purchase requirements gave rise to non-utility owned cogenerated power. Well, this was one of only many provisions buried deep in the Act, but now it's recognized as the nose under the tent that showed the world that, indeed, power generation was not a natural monopoly that only a regulated utility could handle. It's something that anybody with good sense and good investment and good technology could get into, and not only compete but make it better. Purpose 210 was so successful in opening the door that the provision was largely discontinued on a going forward basis in the current energy law. An intense 4-year lobby battle made that happen as well. So the progress achieved under PURPA led to for small generation led in 1992 in the Energy Policy Act of that year to all generation basically be given a deregulation certificate. The exempt wholesale generators, also known as the independent power producers, were regardless of size, regardless of who their customers were given the ability to generate power at wholesale. In that law, a lot of angst was spent over the Federal Power Act wheeling provisions under Sections 210 and 212 of that Act, but it was the EWG exemption that really got the ball rolling and allowed FERC to then follow it up with the open access regulations in '96 to open up the big grid. So in that light of the fact that little provisions somewhere actually moving to be in the headline story some 10 years later, my bets are in the seemingly modest provisions of the electricity title, Section 1211, the mandatory reliability standards, Section 1251 and 1252, which relate to net metering and smart metering, as we just heard about from the prior panel, and 1254, the distributed generation interconnection provisions. I didn't talk a lot about the latter three as a FERC chairman because, one, it wasn't under FERC's jurisdiction, but two, sometimes when you talk about something, people go make it worse. So if you kind of keep it quiet and focus on something over here and talk a lot about it and you don't really care about it, they leave this one alone and they go muck this one up and you don't really care anyway. It's a nasty game, folks. The best thing is just not to need anything from the elected class. Let them handle the wars and the taxes and all that stuff, and then let's let the entrepreneurs and the good technology get in there and win. But that's just a political statement about small government. The Continental transmission grid reliability standards are now going to be compulsory and not voluntary. And while they will continue to be developed by industry experts, it will be through the transparent process under the watchful eye of the FERC and its counterparts in Canada and eventually Mexico. FERC has an independent responsibility to review any of these reliability standards for their impact on the competitive market and innovation. And it will also end the days of what I call least common denominator standard setting in the back room and be driven more by the best practices that tend to pull people up. And we're already starting to see that in the grid now in response to a lot of the more transparent processes that the blackout put into motion, where people are starting to tell the truth about this is a good system and here's what makes it good, this is not a good system and here's what they need to work on. We still don't call it bad because it's just the gentleman's club thing going on still, but that's all right. As long as it results in a better grid, I'm happy however we slice the pie. The steepness of the angle toward the upward drive toward best practices is going to be in FERC's hands, and I think in the next couple of months they'll tip their hands as to how stern and stiff they're willing to be. To the other end of the wire, these other three provisions, net metering, smart metering, and distributed generation, while the new law leaves substantial opportunity for slow rolling at the state level, Congress took some very positive steps to force the opening of the distribution system to customers who wish to use power much more efficiently or to generate their own power either for consumption or for resale or for both. This is a direct assault on the last bastion of monopoly control in this industry, which is the end-use customer premises. I think that these steps to open up the meter will provide for the power industry the same oomph that the 1982 deregulation of telephone consumer premises equipment, CPE. Now, I wasn't here for the earlier analogy to telecom, but it was specifically this deregulation in 1982, the same year they were opening up Ma Bell for the long distance, which everybody actually credits as the event that caused this to happen. It was actually, and I will go toe-to-toe with anybody on this one, it was the deregulation of the little plug in the wall that allowed, the now universal phone jack in the wall, that allowed the innovations to happen. Remember, for you old-timers in the audience like me or older, innovation in that era was the black clunker rotary dial telephone hardwired into the wall. The innovation was you could get a beige version of the same thing hanging on the wall. And if you had connections at Southwestern Bell, you could get a princess phone, a little oval-shaped thing for your daughter's bedroom. By saying to customers and more directly to those creative entrepreneurs and inventors who wanted to serve them that what was off limits is now wide open, the FCC opened the gates for an explosive quarter century of innovation. All kinds of phones, fax machines, wireless phones, dial-up access to something called the Internet, and now broadband. I keep reading the Wall Street Journal every morning just to see what's going to be the next thing, because it's always in column 2. You'll find about one a week will be the seed for that next innovation. That is the fruit and the well-versed fruit, I think, of this broad deregulatory effort that was, I think, a brilliant move back in the 80s. The power industry, which I would argue is more essential to our way of life than the telecoms industry, is at the same brink today. The commodity has been deregulated. The 70% of the customer's bill that is generation, the men and women who work at the plants, the fuel, the big or small plants. The delivery grid remains regulated, the 25% of the bill. And the little balance, the 5%, the meter, the retail service operation is now being opened up. That franchise is opened up. So where do we go from here? Smart house, home generation, and therefore the importance of net metering. Varying levels of reliability as the customer wants. Power quality varies. Certainly a semiconductor manufacturer wants it a little bit different than a residential user. These are exciting to be sure, but much like the telecom industry, I do think that the real interesting things to look for are going to be those one-off innovations that honestly I'm not that creative enough to be able to estimate what they'll be. But all I can say is black rotary dial, BlackBerry, 15 years between them. Big gulf. These two sets of provisions, big grid, little grid, in the energy bill are in support of two very different visions of the future. The big grid, the traditional one, but one improved to handle a much larger regional, even international scope of power trade, and the radically decentralized grid supported by tens of thousands of small-scale generation sources. Both grids would be a far cry from the move at no more than 150 miles approach, low-tech workhorse grid that we've got today and have had well working for the past third of a century, because they're different because they would be enhanced with the smart grid technologies that enable customers customization of what services they want, more efficient dispatch based on what the customer's choices are, whether they're based on economics or environmental needs or both. And I have to say, Michelle, to answer your question, regulators in designing a market are probably better in undesigning barriers to the entries to that market. I think we've designed a market pretty well in Texas, but I've tried it to do it on the federal level. It just was not easy to do. So I think regulators are uniformly better at pulling back the curtain and getting the uglies out of the way that prevent, entrepreneur spirit from just sweeping the room. And I think that will be probably the best way to answer your question. Now, I'm not the most sophisticated of gamblers when I go to those boats in Louisiana, but I'm the one that puts the chip on both the red and the black and the roulette wheel just so I win something. It's been my way to do it as a career as a regulator of the power industry. Strong support for a more robust and independent big grid, and strong support for distributed generation on the small side. Bet on both, dismantle as many barriers to entry as you can do, and get out of the way. Let the entrepreneurs come in and do it. And here comes Dr. Smalley, our visionary patron, betting on both of them too, and having the guts to spell out what that bright future would look like. And I just want to read from the Institute's memorial to him that Amy sent me. Under Smalley's vision, optimized local storage systems would be based on improved batteries, hydrogen conversion systems, and flywheels, while mass primary power input to the grid could come from remote locations with large-scale access to cleaner energy systems, solar farms, stranded natural gas, closed system, clean coal plants, and wave power, to the common grid via carbon nanotubes, high-voltage wires that minimize loss. Excess hydrogen produced in the system could be used in the transportation sector, and excess residential electricity could be used to recharge plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Innovative technological improvements in long-distance continental power grids that could transport hundreds of gigawatts over 1,000 miles instead of 100 megawatts over shorter miles over the same distance, would permit access to very remote sources, including large solar farms in the deserts where local storage can be used as a buffer. Remote nuclear power sources could be located far from populated areas and behind military fences to address proliferation concerns, and clean coal plants could be located wherever it's convenient and economical to strip out and sequester the CO2. Now that's betting on both grids, folks, and then running the table. In the Smalley casino, the nation is the winner. And I like that. So what do we need to do to get there? First of all, as I mentioned, well, actually I haven't mentioned, and I'll mention because it's important. Get an independent, smart power grid, both a high voltage and low voltage grid. I say them in that order because I think it's only with an independent grid, and by independent I mean independently operated and owned. We have operated now with the RTOs and ISOs, but independently owned power grid that is independent of other business interests in the power industry, generation, serving customers, other issues. Their job is to move whatever they need to move or optimize whatever they need to optimize and make the customer happy. I think it's only with an independent grid that we will get the sort of smart grid that we must have to achieve something like the vision Dr. Smalley envisioned. R&D and new investment on the wire side is still anemic, as we just heard, primarily because up to now power's been so cheap. There was no economic incentive to improve the grid. But with the unbundling of the industry, all this is slowly changing. The question is no longer how can we provide a more affordable bundled service, what we call electricity, to the customer, but how can we unleash all the latent value in each part of the whole stream, from the fuel to the appliance? And because the question is different, so is the answer. One event that I think will facilitate this for the grid is the standalone wires company. We have one here in Houston with CenterPoint, which I think was probably the first one in the country, where they don't own the power plants and they don't own the customers. They just run the wires. I hope the rest of ERCOT will follow suit. In Michigan, the transmission assets of Detroit Edison are now a standalone transmission company that's publicly traded recently and as a ITC. Across the state, Transelect, a private equity company, took over Consumers Power Grid. The state of Wisconsin utilities have combined into a little bit different operation, but it's a integrated statewide grid called the American Transmission Company. Up north in Alberta and Ontario, same thing. And Congress gave tax incentives in this in last year's tax package and repeated them in this year's energy bill for companies here to do the same thing. Why is this important? If delivery is your only business, then you focus on how to make it even better. First, you maintain it a whole lot better. That means things like trimming trees under power lines. Sounds familiar to anybody in the Northeast in August of '03? You use the grid more efficiently as the national grid in the United Kingdom does, just optimizing it and using it better. You are open to new technology like superconductivity, which you heard about first thing this morning, storage, which we've got going on through this conference, more DC links on the grid, real-time telemetry of many more points of the grid, etc. And in the early days of this transformation, because they're still regulated monopolies, they can be more of a risk taker on this new technology because the regulator will probably be pretty prone to letting them get their money back with a profit. This can provide, I think, the jump start for more wires R&D and move from the 1950 grid to the 2050 grid. From my years hanging around monopolies of all sorts, I do want to put a lingering question out here, though. Will a monopoly actually want to innovate? Hold that thought for a minute. Which leads to a second point about what we need to do to get something like Dr. Smalley's vision. Get the prices right. The opening of the network industries, gas, power, and telecom, has been stimulated in large part by the I should say the very tedious regulatory process called unbundling. Unbundling the network costs and setting the cost of the regulated entity based on the actual uses. Now that sounds like regulatory gobbledygook, but it is the critical point. In the power industry, this means charging the cost of the high voltage grid only to those customers who actually use generation to move power over that grid to their premises, and not to those customers who don't. We did a version of this, a light version I should admit, in Texas in 2000, 2001, when, for example, we set the transmission rates on the basis of summer peak day use only. Those customers, like larger industrial customers, for example, who had the ability to shift demand off peak, could now reduce their transmission charges by their own activity. Now, admittedly, that's not real-time pricing. It's probably over the year that takes time, but that still happens. Similarly, on the low-voltage distribution system, we need to charge its cost according to the actual peak use of that system as well. We didn't take that step in Texas yet either because, quite frankly, the effective metering means to measure that were not available, but it's only a matter of time. And, of course, this would mean that customers with on-site generation, such as rooftop solar panels or other active generation that could avoid paying for the grid that they don't use. On the price side, there remains also in this regard a very oddly named, not oddly, but nicely named thing called a standby charge, which is a standby charge on motivated customers that are intended to discourage them from saying they're off the grid and then leaning on it. What they ended up motivating customers to do is just not to do anything at all, which is too bad. Eliminating these charges and these price disparities at the distribution level as well as the transmission level will take state regulator courage and attention to detail, which is, again, numbing, but it will come. And finally, the third thing that we need to do to get to Dr. Smalley's vision of a future grid is more open interconnection. Yes, we're basically there on the big grid. Some of the costs of the allocation costs remain open in some parts of the country, but by and large, the interconnection of big generation is resolved. So what I mean about what remains open for us to look at here for more open interconnection are two parts. First, the further interconnection of small-scale generation. This is the focus of FERC's Order 2006 that came out this year, and of Section 1254 of this new energy law, which is one of the little four buried gems that I mentioned a moment ago. Because so much of the distribution system to which small-scale generation would attach is under state jurisdiction, the FERC and the RTO ISOs may not be able to influence the debate as sharply as they did when we were talking about large generators hooking up to transmission. So that's why the prod to the states from the Congress in Section 1254 is so important for them to get it done. The second form of more open interconnection that we need is the interconnection of non-generation applications to the grid. This is one I think builds on a question from the last panel. It's like, are we just revamping the grid and all that stuff? What you're doing here is what you want to do here is allow for really other transmission alternatives and other technologies other than just hooking up a generator to get hooked up to the grid. I should posit here that I don't think that a centrally controlled power grid is what we're talking about. A decentralized internet model is here to stay. I think that that's one thing that clearly you'll have some air traffic control functions, certainly like the ones that RTOs do today, continue in a relatively regional or centralized manner, but by and large the power grid itself would be much more interactive and much more plug and play than we have seen in the past. So what kind of questions are we talking about when we talk about interconnection of non-generation applications to the grid? Will we see an independent developer of a capacitor bank, for example, be able to hook up to the grid and sell reactive power? Lord only knows it's still a challenge to get it right to figure out how generators can sell reactive power in this market. But that's a market issue, and it's not an interconnection issue. A DC line from renewable resource-rich British Columbia down to San Francisco Bay, who loves renewables, can that one be interconnected to the U.S. grid? We've got some in New England that were done over severe political opposition, but they did get done. Can a storage application, such as the ones we're going to talk about tomorrow, I believe, be employed by an innovative provider, or is the local wires company still going to be the gatekeeper and an uninterested gatekeeper? Even if the gate is open to the entrepreneur, will the international reliability standards adopted by NERC impede the interconnection of such technologies? I.e., will this standard setter, which I agree with Dr. Hartley is an appropriate role to be done over a broad boundary such as a nation or international compact, act like the old monopoly and stifle or squelch innovative solutions? What about the armchair quantum wire, which I think we're talking about later today, the continuous cable of nanotubes that's been discussed both at earlier Baker Institute conferences and other technologies, other transmission technologies? Can these actually become part of the grid without having to go through the approval mechanism of a regulated utility that's just kind of running the old way of doing things? Can a brand new technology get into this arena without being nudged out of the way? Well, allowing for interconnection of this nature starts to erode the concept of a franchise territory and creates both opportunities and problems. This is, folks, a very pervasive form of interconnection than we have ever talked about to date. But it's the one that's necessary to make this next step that we're all talking about here with all the new technology platform happen. And can happen without gutting what we've got, but allow it to just be piece-parted, replaced over time with the new technologies as people can envision and can get recompensated for. I can easily envision the day when parts of the grid, particularly those parts which fail to keep up with technology and fail to incorporate the best available technology, become stranded investment. Will the grid regulator come to the rescue for the stranded investment cost recovery as we did for high-cost utility generation? I think one dance with that partner was enough, I suspect, for most regulators. I think that competition, which has already transformed so much of this industry, will finally work its magic on the remaining regulated part. And independence, unbundling, and interconnection will drive us to Dr. Smiley's vision. Well, a former boss of mine said, what Texans can dream, Texans can do. And since some of you aren't from Texas, I do want to do a little bit of ad here. This boss of mine was right. We did start the forward-looking reforms to the power industry, power grid here. Those that we didn't start, we shamelessly borrowed from other people, and we're happy to give them the credit when we did. We were the first to have an independently operated power grid. We've seen the ruthless efficiency of our market do more to shut down dirty, old, inefficient power plants than a generation of environmental regulation has ever been able to do. This is the only state where the expansion of the transmission grid has just about caught up with the needs of the market, with some transmission in West Texas wind permitted and under construction to address the concern that was raised 2 panels ago, and where the cost of congestion are just now starting to actually go down, different than every other part of the country. And we pioneered here the most efficient and effective market-based renewable energy investment program in the country. I'll go on, but modesty and time are a virtue here in Texas. So will we in Texas and in the rest of the continent go the next steps and get to a robust, flexible, more open, smart power system capable of supporting Dr. Smiley's vision? I think so. How do I know this? Well, it has something to do with the fact that this discussion is taking place here in Houston. You see, we've done this vision becomes reality thing before. Right down I-45 from here, I hope, on the way to the Galveston Beach is NASA, the heart of our nation's space program. Full of Texans and non-Texans alike, it has been another of the great science-based infrastructure challenges, and it has underpinned so much of our world's technological advancement in the past 40 years. In a most memorable moment, that program did land a man on the moon when I was 7 years old. Fittingly, the first word ever uttered from another heavenly body wasn't "the eagle has landed" or "Tranquility Base here." It was Houston. Enough said.
Pat will take a couple questions. We have a couple questions from the audience. You're all barbecued out? Come on. No? Here we go.
Yes, sir.
You said you disrupted technology here. So far, all morning, what I've heard is generation, transmission, distribution. Where do you see a disruption in this value chain?
He asked, where do you see the disruptive technology? We've talked about generation, transmission, distribution. I have to say, I think that there's enough disruptive in each of those three camps that I think we could be busy here for the balance of the millennium. But I think probably it would, again, I mentioned because of the telephone analogy, I think we'll probably see the most disruptive, and I'm not enough of a gypsy to foretell what it would be specifically, but I think where it will be on the customer premises side. I think behind the meter is where you'll see the most innovation and the most ability to really kind of change the paradigm. Generation will continue to drive efficiency, but that'll probably be arithmetic growth, not the kind of geometric thing that is associated with a disruptive technology. Mr. Gotfelty.
Do we collect and analyze the right data at both the transmission and the distribution level to actually
Jimmy asked the question, do we collect the right data at the T&D level to really get us to this new vision? I think we're just barely collecting enough data to kind of look at the 1950s vision. We had to implement, when I was at the PUC about 5 or 6 years ago, reliability standards called KD, KFI, SAIDI, SAIFI, which measure the duration of outages and the frequency of outages on the transmission and distribution line in order to set the utilities rates pegged to something as kind of basic as that. To get to that level, I think certainly the smart metering, that would be definitely a fallout of that. But I haven't seen the case be made, and it wasn't in the statute as far as the support for smart metering, which we all talked about in your panel. The case wasn't made that you need it for better optimization of the grid and better laying out of the grid. It really was a focus on what the customer needed, which is fine. I'm all for what the customer needs, but I don't think that the public debate has been about getting the smart meters online to get together that kind of data at all. So, no, I think probably every industry I've been involved in regulating had a real dearth of data, period. And quite frankly, every one of these things has been done almost more for an ideological basis, which is nothing wrong with that. I think it's a question of what is the role of government in regulating these industries than of a pure economic efficiency argument. So I don't know that you need data to keep going, but if you're going to have a part of the industry that's going to stay regulated for a while longer, and I think the wires business will be, even with interconnection of other technology, a more sanguine understanding about what's working and what's not working can't be based on anecdotes and the like. It's got to be based on hard numbers, because that's what drives, I think, good policy. Again, I'm not so sure that good policy is exactly what's gotten us where we've gotten, but, you know, that's probably the way we'd like to go forward would be the right way. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat.